48 hours before my public execution, the only thing operating flawlessly in the building was me. The restaurant at 6 in the morning was a completely different beast than it was at 8 in the evening. Before the golden chandeliers were dialed up to their intoxicating warm hum, the dining room was stark, silent, and cold. The city outside was still waking up, painting floor-to-ceiling windows in bruised shades of violet and gray. This was my favorite time-off day. It was the only hour where the space felt like it belonged to the people who actually kept its heart beating. I pushed through the heavy stainless steel double doors into the kitchen, the sharp scent of industrial bleach giving way to the rich, earthy aroma of roasting bones for the veal demi-glace. The kitchen staff moved with the synchronized, silent efficiency of a military unit. "Morning, Z," Chef Laurent grunted without looking up from the massive slab of yellowfin tuna he was breaking down. "Morning, Chef. You're short on prep today?" I asked, eyeing the mountain of fingerling potatoes resting near the sinks. Julian called out. "Car trouble. I'm down a man on the line." I didn't hesitate. I dropped my bag in the corner, thoroughly washed my hands and grabbed a paring knife. For the next 40 minutes before the front-of-house staff even began to trickle through the doors, I stood shoulder to shoulder with the line cooks, turning potatoes and segmenting grapefruits until my fingers ached. I didn't have to do it. It wasn't in my job description as a server. But in a place like this, you survived by becoming indispensable. Andy respected the kitchen far more than I respected the management. By the time the other servers arrived, looking bleary-eyed and clutching iced coffees, I was already in my crisp, impeccably pressed black uniform. I stood at the hostess stand, my eyes tracking the newly printed seasonal menus. I didn't just read them, I devoured the mechanics off them. Pan-seared Hokkaido scallops with a yuzu kosho emulsion. Dry-aged duck breast with a sour cherry gastrique. I memorized the flavor profiles, the allergens, the wine pairings, internalizing the data until I could recite it backwards while balancing 3 scalding plates on my arm. Excellence wasn't just a habit for me, it was armor. If I was perfect, they couldn't touch me. That theory was tested 3 hours later during the absolute chaos of the lunch rush. The dining room was a sea of sharp suits and corporate expense accounts. The noise level was a sophisticated roar of clinking silverware and high-stakes deal-making. I was navigating the floor with a tray of martinis when I saw the commotion at table 4.mr. Harrison, a notorious regular who treated the wait staff like his personal punching bags, was aggressively gesturing at a terrified junior server named Maya. Her hands were trembling so badly she was on the verge of spilling a pitcher of ice water. I said no alliums. Harrison's voice cut through the ambient noise, his face flushing a dangerous shade of red. "Are you deaf or just stupid? There are chives in this puree. Do you want to send me to the hospital?" I intercepted the disaster before Maya could start crying. I slid the tray of martinis onto a nearby service station and smoothly stepped between them. "Mr. Harrison, my deepest apologies," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, hypnotic register designed to de-escalate. "That is entirely unacceptable. Maya was just informing me of Thekichan's error. I am personally taking this back." "It's a complete lack of competence," he sneered, leaning back in his leather chair, though his volume immediately dropped. "You are absolutely right," I agreed without hesitation, picking up the offending plate. "And because we value your time, I already have Chef Laurent firing a fresh, perfectly modified order of the sea base for you. It will be out in exactly 4 minutes. In the meantime, please allow me to bring you a glass of the 14 Berlot, compliments of the house, for the inconvenience." Harrison blinked, the wind entirely taken out of his sails by the seamless, frictionless submission. He adjusted his cuffs, his posture relaxing. "Well, make sure it's a generous pour." "Of course, sir." I walked the plate back to the kitchen, gave Chef the modification and poured the wine. When I returned to the floor, Maya pulled me into the shadow of the service hallway, looking at me like I had just performed a miracle. "How do you do that?" she whispered, her eyes wide. "He was ready to get me fired. You didn't even blink." "Never argue with an ego, Maya," I murmured, adjusting my apron. "You just absorb the momentum and redirect it. He doesn't want to be right, he just wants to feel powerful. Let him have his 4 minutes of power. It costs us nothing." She shook her head in awe. "You're too smart to be working here, Zerai." I offered her a tight, polite smile and turned back to the dining room. "If you only knew, I thought that'd be why 3 o'clock. The lunch rush had finally bled out, leaving the restaurant in that brief, exhausted purgatory before the dinner service began. Most of the staff huddled outside in the freezing alley to smoke, or slumped over the tables in the back corner to complain about their tips. I retreated to the cramped, windowless break room in the basement. It smelled perpetually of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner. I sat on a wobbly plastic chair, ignoring the unglamorous surroundings, and reached into my bag that I didn't pull out a phone to endlessly scroll through social media. Instead, I withdrew a thick leather-bound notebook and the latest issue of the Financial Times. Tucked inside the newspaper was a highly confidential 100-page prospectus on leveraged corporate buyouts. I clicked my pen and began to read, instantly transporting myself out of the basement and into the world where I truly belonged. I tracked aggressive acquisition strategies, studying how failing umbrella corporations mask their debt by shuffling liabilities between shell companies. My eyes scanned the margins where I had scribbled notes on property liquidation and mezzanine financing. I was deep into a complex breakdown of hostile takeover loopholes when the air in the room suddenly changed. The sharp, aggressive clack-clack-clack of designer heels echoed on the linoleum. Corrine Vayle stood in the doorway. Our manager looked like she belonged on the floor of the dining room rather than managing it, wrapped in a suffocating cloud of Tom Ford perfume and wearing a scowl that seemed permanently etched into her sharp features. Her eyes darted around the tiny break room, landing on me. She didn't see a woman analyzing multi-million-dollar financial maneuvers. She only saw the black apron. She only saw the help. "Zerai," Corrine said, her voice dripping with an exhausted condescension that made my jaw tighten. "Yes, Corrine." I kept my voice neutral, leaving the newspaper open on the table. She walked closer, her eyes dropping to the pages of complex financial data and stock tickers. A small, mocking smile played on her lips. She didn't understand a word of what was in the page, but she recognized ambition, and in her world, ambition in a subordinate was an insult. "Don't waste your time reading things you can't understand," she said softly, reaching out and casually flipping the cover of the Financial Times closed. It landed with a dull smack against the plastic table. "The crystal in the main dining room is spotting. Grab a microfiber cloth and polish the glasses. All of them. Before the dinner shift." It was a punishment meant for a busboy. It was a petty, unnecessary display of dominance, designed to remind me exactly where I stood in her hierarchy. A dozen responses flared in my mind. I could have told her that my personal portfolio was worth more than this entire restaurant's annual revenue. I could have bought the designer shoes off her feet with the interest I earned before breakfast. The urge to snap back to shatter her fragile, arrogant reality burned hot in the back of my throat. But I looked at her, at her desperate need to feel superior in this windowless basement, and I let the fire die out. I was playing a much longer game. I carefully picked up my pen, slid it into the spiral of my leather notebook and gathered my things. I stood up, keeping my posture perfectly straight, and looked her in the eye. "Right away, Corrine," I said, my voice smooth and devoid of any rebellion. I walked past her, letting her have her pathetic victory, completely unaware that she had just ordered the architect of her impending destruction to polish her glassware. Welcome to Twistofferal TV. If you stop halfway through this story, you will wake up in a cold sweat, dreaming and wondering what happened at the end, so sit back, relax, and watch to the very end. Please like, share, and subscribe to Twistofferal TV for more captivating stories just like this one. I would also love to know where you are watching this story from, so please say your country in the comment section below. Now let's get into the ultimate comeback. The cloth and headed upstairs to polish the glass, completely unaware that in just 2 days, Corrine Vayle would be begging me for her job. By 6 o'clock, the dining room had fully transformed from a quiet, sunlit sanctuary into a theater of weaponized wealth. The chandeliers were dimmed to that specific, golden hour amber that made diamonds catch the light just right. The air was thick with the scent of white truffles, expensive gin, and the quiet hum of dangerous money. I stood by the service station, my apron tied perfectly, my hands steady, waiting for the curtain to rise on the dinner service. You could always tell when a true apex predator entered the room. The atmospheric pressure seemed to drop, and the hostesses visibly stiffened. The heavy mahogany doors swung open at exactly 7:15, and in walked Victoria Sterling. She was a woman whose entire existence was a masterclass in aggressive entitlement. Wrapped in a silver chinchilla coat that likely cost more than a luxury sedan, she moved not like a guest, but like an invading monarch. Behind her trailed an entourage of 3 equally polished, aggressively bored-looking women who functioned less as friends and more as a well-dressed audience for Victoria's ego. Chloe, our lead hostess, stepped forward with her most practiced, deferential smile. "Good evening, Mrs. Sterling. We have the corner booth prepared for you." Victoria didn't even look at her. She simply held up a single, manicured hand, cutting the hostess off mid-sentence. "Table 1, she commanded, her voice a sharp, nasal drawl that easily pierced the ambient noise of the restaurant. "And I want the tall girl. The one who actually knows how to pour without breathing down my neck." Chloe blinked, panicked, her eyes darting toward the floor chart. Table 1 wasn't in my section tonight, but in this establishment, the floor chart was merely a suggestion when a billionaire made a demand. I didn't wait for Chloe to drown. I stepped out from the shadow of the service station and glided toward the front, my expression shifting into a mask of placid, impenetrable courtesy. "Good evening, Mrs. Sterling," I said, my voice pitched to that perfect, soothing frequency. "It is a pleasure to have you back with us. Please, allow me to show you to table 1. Victoria finally looked at me, her eyes sweeping up and down my uniform as if inspecting a piece of mildly disappointing furniture. "Finally. Someone competent." She shrugged off her heavy fur without turning around, fully expecting me to catch it. I stepped forward smoothly, letting the heavy, suffocating weight of the coat drape over my arms rather than letting it hit the floor. As I seated them, the microaggressions began immediately, piling up like snow before an avalanche. Before I had even distributed the menus, Victoria snapped her fingers in my direction, a sharp, piercing crack right next to my ear. "Water. Sparkling. But I swear, if you bring me that domestic garbage you serve the tourists, I will send it back. San Pellegrino, chilled, no ice. The ice waters it down." "Right away, madam," I replied smoothly. When I returned with the water, one of her friends slid her empty martini glass toward the edge of the table, not making eye contact. "Another. And tell the bartender not to be stingy with the olives this time." I had to go digging for the last one. Of course. Every interaction was a calculated degradation. I wasn't a person to them, I was an extension of the cutlery, a voice-activated service machine meant to absorb their dissatisfaction with the world. They loudly critiqued the lighting, claiming it washed out their complexions. They complained that the ambient jazz was too depressing. Through it all, I nodded, smiled, and moved with flawless, invisible efficiency, boxing away my pride into a dark, quiet corner of my mind. I was just finishing decanting a $300 bottle of Cabernet for them when the temperature in the room shifted again. Magnus Ravel descended upon table 1 like a vulture spotting a fresh kill. Our boss practically materialized out of the shadows, his tailored suit immaculate, his teeth bared in a blinding, insincere smile. He completely ignored me as he stepped into the space, placing both hands on the edge of Victoria's table as if he were greeting a long-lost sister. "Victoria. My absolute favorite guest," Magnus crooned, his voice dripping with an oily charm that made my stomach turn. "I saw your name on the books and had to come over personally. Is the Cabernet breathing well? Do we need to open the vault for something older?" Victoria's harsh demeanor melted instantly into a preening, satisfied smirk. "Magnus, darling. It's adequate. Though your lighting in here is starting to feel a bit dreary, don't you think?" "I'll have them adjust the dimmers immediately," Magnus promised without missing a beat, though we both knew the dimmers were locked. He shot a glance over his shoulder. "I hope Zerai is taking excellent care of you? She's one of our best." "She's fine," Victoria said dismissively, waving a hand. "Though I expect perfection tonight, Magnus. We are celebrating my divorce finalizing. I want nothing but the absolute best." "And you shall have it," Magnus practically bowed. He stepped back from the table, his smile remaining fixed in place until he was exactly 3 steps away. Then, the warmth vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating machinery of a man who worshipped nothing but profit margins. He caught my eye and jerked his head sharply toward the narrow service corridor. I set my serving tray down and followed him into the shadows between the kitchen doors and the wine cellar. The moment we were out of sight of the dining room, Magnus turned to me. There was no trace of the charming host left. His eyes were flat, hard, and utterly devoid of empathy. "Listen to me very carefully," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh, strained whisper. That table represents $5,000 tonight alone, not including her corporate accounts that keep this place in the black during the slow season. She is not a guest. She is an investment. I am aware, Mr. Ravel. I have her section entirely under control, I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. Magnus stepped a fraction of an inch closer, invading my personal space in a deliberate tactic of physical intimidation. I could smell the sharp peppermint on his breath and the expensive cologne that failed to mask his underlying anxiety. Under control isn't good enough, he hissed. I saw the way she looked at her glass. If she complains about the service, if she even hints that her evening was anything less than spectacular, it falls on you. I don't care what she asks for. I don't care if she wants the moon cut into quarters and served on a silver platter. I don't care if it's completely unreasonable, and I definitely don't care about your feelings. He reached out, tapping a heavy finger aggressively against the name tag pinned to my uniform. Whatever she wants, Zerai. Make it happen. Do not embarrass me. He didn't wait for a response. He simply turned on his heel and strode back into the dining room, adjusting his cuffs and plastering that fake, blinding smile back onto his face as he approached another table of wealthy investors. I stood alone in the dim service corridor for 3 long seconds. My reflection caught in the polished chrome of the espresso machine beside me. I looked perfectly composed. Not a hair out of place, my posture rigidly straight. But beneath the uniform, my heart was hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I had spent my entire life studying risk, analyzing markets, and reading the subtle indicators of impending collapse. I knew how to spot a bad investment, and I knew how to recognize a trap. Victoria Sterling wasn't just a difficult customer. She was a lit match, and Magnus had just soaked the entire floor in gasoline. He had effectively stripped me of all authority, practically inviting the VIP to abuse me, while entirely removing his own liability. If I defended myself, I was insubordinate. If I failed to please an impossible woman, I was incompetent. A cold, heavy knot of dread settled in the pit of my stomach. The air in the restaurant suddenly felt entirely too thin to breathe. I smoothed my apron with damp palms, picked up my silver serving tray, and stepped back out into the blinding, golden light of the dining room. I didn't know exactly what was going to happen tonight. But as I watched Victoria Sterling sneer at a busboy across the room, I knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that something very, very bad was coming. By 8:30, the dining room was operating at maximum velocity, a perfectly choreographed ballet of crystal, silver, and simmering egos. The ambient noise had swelled to a steady, oppressive hum. I moved through the narrow spaces between the tables like a ghost, balancing plates that cost more than most people made in a week, my face a carefully constructed mask of serene compliance. Table 1, however, remained a black hole in the center of the room, demanding a constant, exhausting orbit. Victoria Sterling and her entourage had already sent back 2 bottles of wine, claiming the first was corked and the second lacked character, and had complained about the draft from a non-existent vent. I absorbed every barb, every condescending sigh, and every dismissive flick of their wrists with frictionless grace. I was a vault. Nothing they did could penetrate my armor. Then came the main courses. Chef Laurent was a perfectionist, but even perfectionists falter when a kitchen is down a man and drowning in VIP modifications. I carried the heavy silver tray to table 1, distributing the plates with precise, fluid movements. For Victoria, it was the dry-aged Wagyu fillet, explicitly ordered rare, resting on a bed of whipped parsnip puree. It looked like a culinary masterpiece, glistening under the amber light of the chandelier. I took 2 steps back, clasping my hands behind my back in the standard posture of attentive waiting as they took their first bites. Victoria picked up her steak knife. She didn't slice the meat, she operated on it, cutting precisely into the center of the fillet and pulling the halves apart. Instead of a deep, warm ruby red, the center of the meat was a muted, blushing pink. It was medium rare. A matter of perhaps 60 seconds too long on the grill. In 99% of the world, it was an exceptional piece of meat. At table 1, it was an act of war. Victoria didn't say a word at first. She simply dropped her silver knife onto the pristine white porcelain. Clink. The sound was sharp enough to cut glass. It was a deliberate, weaponized sound, designed to summon me the way one might whistle for a disobedient dog. The 3 women flanking her stopped eating immediately, their eyes darting from the steak to Victoria, their faces tightening with anticipating cruelty. They smelled blood in the water. I stepped forward, my posture impeccably straight, my voice maintaining its soothing, hypnotic register. "Is everything to your liking, Mrs. Sterling?" Victoria slowly turned her head. Her eyes were chips of absolute ice. "Do I look like a woman who enjoys chewing on leather?" "My deepest apologies, madam," I said smoothly, automatically moving into the standard de-escalation protocol. I reached for the edge of the plate. "I can see the center is slightly over the temperature you requested. Please, allow me to take this back to the kitchen. I will have chef fire a new fillet for you immediately, and I will personally ensure it is prepared to a perfect rare." It was the textbook response. It was the only acceptable procedure. Take the plate, fix the problem, offer a complimentary glass of wine, and erase the error. But as my fingertips brushed the rim of the porcelain, Victoria's hand shot out. Her perfectly manicured fingers clamped over my wrist like a vice. Her acrylic nails dug painfully into my skin, stopping me cold. "Leave it," she hissed. I froze, my pulse thrumming against the cage of her grip. "Mrs. Sterling, I cannot allow you to eat a meal that is anything less than—" I said leave it, she interrupted, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper that carried far more threat than a shout. She released my wrist and leaned back in her plush leather chair, crossing her arms. "I don't want a new steak. By the time your incompetent chef ruins another piece of meat, my guests will be finished with their meals, and I will be forced to eat alone. You have already ruined my evening." "I am truly sorry for the inconvenience," I said, keeping my voice utterly level, though the muscles in my jaw were locking tight. "How may I make this right for you?" Victoria smiled. It was a terrifying expression, devoid of any actual joy. She wasn't looking for a culinary fix, she was looking for a target. She had gone through a brutal, highly publicized divorce, her ego had been bruised on a public stage, and she desperately needed to break someone else to feel whole again. Magnus had practically handed me to her on a silver platter. "You can make it right," Victoria purred, leaning forward so that only I and her silent, watchful friends could hear. "By apologizing properly." "I apologize unreservedly, madam," I said. "No, no, no," she tutted, waving a finger in the air. "Not like that. You stand there looking down your nose at me, practically robotic, as if this is just another minor inconvenience in your day. I want you to feel the weight of your incompetence." She paused, her eyes glinting with a dark, malicious thrill. "I want you to get on your knees and apologize to me." For a fraction of a second, the ambient noise of the entire restaurant seemed to completely drop away. The clinking glasses, the jazz music, the low hum of conversation, it all vanished into a ringing silence in my ears. I stared at her. I catalogued the cruel twist of her mouth, the glittering diamonds at her throat, the absolute, unwavering entitlement radiating from her pores. She was entirely serious. In the middle of a packed, high-end dining room, she wanted me to physically kneel on the hardwood floor and beg for her forgiveness over a piece of beef. Beneath my black apron, a dangerous, electric heat flared to life. My mind instantly flashed to the leather notebook in my bag downstairs, to the millions of dollars in liquid assets resting in my accounts, to the absolute certainty that I could buy this woman's entire net worth and liquidate it for sport. The sheer absurdity of the demand almost made me laugh. But I didn't laugh. I kept my face as still as carved marble. "I apologize for the error with your meal, Mrs. Sterling," I said, my voice dropping an octave, losing the subservient customer service lilt and adopting the firm, unyielding tone of a CEO. "But I cannot do that." Victoria's eyes widened, genuine shock registering on her face. She wasn't used to the word no. It was a foreign concept to her, a language she didn't speak. "Excuse me," she breathed, her voice trembling with sudden, volatile rage. "What did you just say to me?" "I am happy to replace your meal. I am happy to comp your entire check," I replied calmly, maintaining direct eye contact, refusing to shrink under her glare. "But I will not kneel." The color drained from Victoria's face, only to return in a violent, furious flush. "Do you have any idea who I am?" she demanded, her voice rising now, drawing the attention of the surrounding tables. Guests at table 2 and table 3 paused their conversations, their heads turning toward the escalating drama. I spend more in this establishment in a month than you will make in your entire miserable life. I could buy this place and fire you myself. You don't have enough capital to buy this place, I thought coldly, and you're about to find out exactly what happens when you threaten someone who does. But this was not the time to drop the mask. I was cornered. If I reacted with anger, I was the aggressive, unprofessional employee. If I complied, I sacrificed the last shred of my humanity. I understand you are very upset, Mrs. Sterling, I said, taking a deliberate, measured step backward, trying to defuse the bomb she was holding. Please, allow me to get the manager for you. Corrine can. I don't want the manager. Victoria shrieked. Suddenly, she pushed her chair back. The heavy wood scraped violently against the floor, a sound that cut through the entire restaurant like a gunshot. Victoria Sterling stood up. It was the ultimate escalation. By standing, she weaponized her privilege, turning a private, hissed conflict into a massive public spectacle. Every single eye in the dining room snapped toward table 1. The servers froze in their tracks. The jazz music suddenly felt horribly loud in the vacuum of human silence. Victoria pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face. Her voice echoed off the gilded ceiling, carrying to the furthest corners of the room. This is completely unacceptable. Your staff is utterly incompetent, and this girl is refusing to apologize for ruining my evening. She is entirely disrespectful. I stood there, anchored to the floor, bathed in the horrified stares of 100 wealthy strangers. The trap had sprung flawlessly shut. It didn't matter what had actually happened. It didn't matter that her demand was deeply, psychologically abusive. In the eyes of the room, she was the aggrieved victim, and I was the insolent servant who had dared to step out of line. A heavy, suffocating wave of dread washed over me, cold and absolute. I didn't have to look over my shoulder to know what was coming next. The frantic, clicking sound of Corrine's heels was already echoing across the dining room floor, followed closely by the heavy, authoritative strides of Magnus Ravel. The executioners had arrived. And I had absolutely nowhere left to run. The echo of Victoria Sterling's voice hung in the amberlit air, a jagged disruption of the restaurant's carefully curated perfection. The silence that followed was heavy and immediate. At adjacent tables, forks were carefully lowered onto porcelain plates. Conversations flatlined. The ambient jazz playing from the hidden speakers suddenly sounded thin and mocking against the sheer weight of the tension. Through that suffocating silence, the sharp, rapid clack-clack-clack of Corrine's designer heels cut across the hardwood floor like a metronome counting down to my execution. She swept into the orbit of table 1, breathless and radiating a frantic, nervous energy. Her eyes darted from the overcooked fillet to Victoria's furious, flushed face, and finally to me, standing perfectly still in the crosshairs. Corrine didn't even pause to assess the reality of the situation. Her survival instincts in this toxic ecosystem kicked in immediately. Protect the money, sacrifice the help. Mrs. Sterling, my deepest, most sincere apologies, Corrine gasped, placing a hand to her chest in a theatrical display of distress. What on earth has happened here? Victoria let out a breathless, dramatic scoff, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. What happened is that your server is completely out of control. I politely informed her that this steak was practically shoe leather, and instead of fixing it, she argued with me. She refused to apologize. She practically threw her attitude in my face. Corrine, I have never been so disrespected in my entire life. It was a masterful, shameless lie. It was spun so effortlessly that for a fraction of a second, I almost marveled at the sheer audacity of it. The three women sitting with Victoria nodded in solemn, synchronized agreement, their eyes wide with fabricated trauma. Corrine didn't turn to ask for my version of events. She didn't look at the pristine presentation of the plate still resting on the table. She simply absorbed Victoria's lie as gospel and weaponized it instantly. When Corrine finally turned to face me, her features were drawn tight with an aggressive, petty rage. This was the moment she had been waiting for since she caught me reading the financial journal in the basement. It was her opportunity to put me back in the dirt. Zerai, Corrine said, her voice a sharp, carrying whip that was entirely meant for the audience of wealthy diners surrounding us. You have completely embarrassed a valued guest. This behavior is entirely unacceptable. We pride ourselves on absolute excellence, and you have chosen to bring your personal attitude onto my floor. I kept my hands clasped tightly behind my back, my nails digging into my palms. I fought to keep my voice level and professional, refusing to let them see me bleed. Corrine, that is not what occurred. I offered to completely replace the meal and comp the check. She refused. She asked me to drop to my knees and beg for her forgiveness. A collective, quiet gasp rippled through the nearest tables. A man at table 3 actually stopped chewing his food, his eyes darting to Victoria in shock. For a brief, agonizing second, I thought the sheer, humiliating absurdity of the demand might actually force Corrine to defend me. It was an HR nightmare. It was a human rights violation wrapped in a luxury dining experience. But Corrine didn't blink. Her expression didn't soften. She simply leaned forward, her voice dropping into a cold, venomous register. "I don't care what she asked you to do," Corrine hissed, the words hitting me like physical blows. "Your job is to make the clients happy. If Mrs. Sterling wants an apology, you give it to her. You do not argue. You do not talk back. You are a server, Zerai. You serve." The utter betrayal of it was staggering. It wasn't just poor management, it was the complete systemic failure of basic human dignity. Before I could even process the dark, suffocating reality of Corrine's words, the crowd of servers and buses hovering near the service station parted. The temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees. Magnus Ravel descended upon the scene. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of an apex predator who had just been disturbed from his slumber. He didn't look frantic like Corrine. He looked deeply, dangerously annoyed. He stepped into the light of the chandelier, his expensive suit immaculate, his face a mask of smooth, polished stone. He sized up the situation in a fraction of a second. The cold calculation in his eyes was unmistakable. I could practically see the ledger balancing in his mind. On one side, Victoria Sterling, her corporate accounts, her billionaire ex-husband's alimony, and her $5,000 bar tabs. On the other side, Zerai Vantrell, an employee making minimum wage plus tips, utterly replaceable by tomorrow morning. "Magnus," Victoria started, her voice immediately shifting from a screech to a wounded, demanding whine. "This girl." Magnus held up a single, manicured hand, silencing the billionaire instantly. The power dynamic shifted, but not in my favor. He didn't even look at me. It was as if I were a stain on the floor, beneath his direct acknowledgement. "Corrine," Magnus said, his voice smooth, low, and terrifyingly calm. "Handle it. We cannot afford to lose vital clients over staff who simply do not understand their place." He didn't ask what happened. He didn't care about the steak, or the kneeling, or the lie. He only cared about the optics of submission. Without casting a single glance in my direction, Magnus turned on his heel and walked away, his heavy footsteps retreating back into the shadows of the VIP lounge. He had washed his hands of the execution, delegating the dirty work to his eager lieutenant. Corrine watched him leave, her chest swelling with the delegated authority. She turned back to me, and for the first time all evening, a genuine smile touched her lips. It was a slight, wicked, deeply satisfied smile. "You heard Mr. Ravel," Corrine said, her voice ringing out clearly in the hushed dining room. "You're fired." The words hung in the air, final and absolute. I gave a single, stiff nod. "Fine. I will collect my things from the back." "No," Corrine snapped, stepping directly into my personal space, blocking my path to the kitchen. Her eyes gleamed with a toxic, vindictive light. Firing me wasn't enough. Victoria had demanded a public humiliation, and Corrine was determined to deliver it to secure her standing with the elite. "You don't get to go in the back. You don't get to walk through my kitchen. Remove your apron. Now." I froze. "Excuse me." "You heard me," Corrine demanded, her voice rising, ensuring every patron in the room could hear the degradation. "Take off the apron. And the vest. You don't get to wear the crest of this establishment for another second. Strip it off, right here, and leave through the front door." A thick, uncomfortable silence smothered the restaurant. The wealthy diners, the people who had watched me cater to their every whim for years, simply looked down at their plates or took long, slow sips of their wine. Not a single person stood up. Not a single voice called out to stop the madness. They were entirely complicit in their cowardly silence, perfectly willing to watch a woman be publicly stripped of her dignity so their dinner service wouldn't be further delayed. I looked at Victoria Sterling. She was leaning back in her plush leather chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a smirk of absolute, sadistic satisfaction plastered across her face. Beside her, her friends were practically vibrating with glee. I looked back at Corrine, who was holding her hand out, waiting for me to surrender the uniform. The injustice of it was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, threatening to crush the air from my lungs. It was the peak of everything toxic and rotten about this world. The unchecked ego, the classism, the absolute certainty that money granted them the right to destroy another human being for sport. They wanted to break me. They wanted to see the tears well up in my eyes. They wanted my hands to shake as I undid the buttons of my uniform. They wanted the ultimate validation of their supreme power. Instead, I took a slow, deep breath, and prepared to give them exactly what they asked for, completely unaware of what it was going to cost them. Corrine's outstretched hand hung in the space between us, perfectly manicured and trembling with the kinetic thrill of her own cruelty. Behind her, Victoria Sterling leaned forward in her plush leather chair, her eyes alight with a predatory hunger, waiting for the break. They were all waiting for it. In this golden, amber-lit amphitheater of wealth, my humiliation was the evening's primary entertainment. They expected the sudden, sharp intake of breath that precedes a sob. They expected my shoulders to cave inward, my eyes to well up with the terrified tears of a woman who had just lost her livelihood. They expected me to beg, to plead, or perhaps to explode into the kind of frantic, unprofessional rage that would only validate their decision to throw me out. Instead, I went completely, absolutely still. The frantic, pounding rhythm of my heart simply stopped, replaced by a slow, glacial calm that flooded my veins like ice water. The persona of Zerai the waitstaff, the invisible, compliant girl who absorbed abuse to keep the peace, evaporated into the suffocating air of the dining room. What was left behind was the woman who built financial empires before her morning coffee. For 3 agonizingly long seconds, the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. 1 second passed. The ambient clinking of silverware entirely ceased. 2 seconds passed. Corrine's triumphant smirk wavered, her extended hand twitching as the silence stretched from uncomfortable into something deeply unnatural. 3 seconds passed. It was the longest silence I had ever experienced, a vacuum of sound that sucked the oxygen out of the room. And then, my expression transformed. The initial, reflex shock melted away, leaving my face a mask of serene, untouchable composure. The corners of my mouth tipped upward. It was a slight, subtle smile, but it contained no warmth. It was a chilling, knowing curve of the lips, the smile of a grandmaster who had just watched her opponent walk blindly into a checkmate. I didn't break eye contact with Corrine as my hands moved to the knot at the small of my back. My fingers didn't shake. I untied the black apron with deliberate, agonizingly slow precision, as if I had all the time in the world. I pulled the heavy fabric away from my waist and began to fold it. I matched the corners perfectly, smoothing the creases over my forearm. Next came the embroidered vest with the restaurant's gilded crest. I unbuttoned it slowly, slipping it off my shoulders with the grace of someone removing a priceless couture jacket, rather than a minimum wage uniform. I folded it just as meticulously, placing it on top of the apron. The silence in the room was no longer born of shock, it was saturated with a creeping, undeniable unease. I wasn't acting like a victim. I was acting like a landlord evicting a troublesome tenant. Holding the neatly folded square of my uniform in both hands, I stepped past Corrine, who instinctively shrank back a half step, her bravado pieced by my unnatural calm. I walked directly up to table 1. Victoria's smug expression faltered, a flicker of genuine apprehension crossing her heavily contoured features as I loomed over her. I didn't throw the uniform. I didn't slam it down. I simply reached out and placed the folded black garments onto the pristine white tablecloth, right next to her ruined fillet. I set it down with the absolute, deliberate precision of placing a crown on an altar. I turned my head. Magnus Ravel had paused at the edge of the dining room, just beneath the archway of the VIP lounge. He had stopped to watch the execution, expecting a messy, satisfying end to his problem. Instead, he was staring at me, his brow furrowed in deep, sudden confusion. I pitched my voice to carry across the quiet room, clear, resonant, and dripping with authority. "I understand," I said to him, holding his gaze until he physically shifted his weight from one polished Oxford shoe to the other. "Thank you for clarifying your priorities, Mr. Ravel." I didn't give him a chance to respond. I pivoted smoothly back to Corrine. Her hand had finally dropped to her side. The flush of victory had drained completely from her cheeks, replaced by a pale, twitching uncertainty. She had wanted to break me, but looking at me now, she suddenly realized she was entirely out of her depth. "Corrine," I said, my voice dropping to a conversational, almost pleasant murmur that somehow sounded more dangerous than a scream. "You should keep my personnel file. You're going to need it." She blinked, her mouth parting slightly, but no words came out. Finally, I looked down at Victoria Sterling. She was staring at the folded apron next to her plate as if it were a venomous snake. The power dynamic had violently shifted, and she could feel it in the air, even if she couldn't understand why. She was sitting in a puddle of her own miserable entitlement, and suddenly, I looked down on her not with anger, but with profound, suffocating pity. "Enjoy your meal," I whispered. I turned my back on table 1. I didn't rush. I didn't look down at the floor. I walked toward the heavy glass doors at the front of the restaurant with my spine perfectly straight and my head held high. My heels clicked against the hardwood in a slow, steady rhythm, a steady drumbeat of impending doom that echoed in the silent room. I pushed through the front doors and stepped out into the freezing city night. The cold air hit my face, sharp and clean, washing away the stench of their arrogance. Back in the dining room, I knew exactly what I had left behind. Corrine would be standing frozen, her mind spinning with paranoia over my parting words. Magnus would be staring at the door, a cold, unexplainable prickle of dread working its way up his spine. Victoria would look at her cold steak and my folded apron, the thrill of her victory entirely hollowed out by my refusal to bleed for her. They thought the transaction was over. They thought they had discarded a piece of trash. They had absolutely no idea that I had just stepped out of their restaurant to go buy it. I smiled into the winter wind, pulled my phone from my pocket, and prepared to burn their empire to the ground. The freezing winter wind off the street felt less like a punishment and more like a baptism. It stripped away the lingering scent of white truffles, arrogant perfume, and the suffocating subservience I had worn for the past 3 years. I didn't look back at the glowing, amber-lit windows of the restaurant. I didn't need to. I already knew every inch of that property, and within 48 hours, my name would be on the deed. I walked 2 blocks east, the sharp click of my heels echoing against the pavement, until I reached the discreet, brushed steel entrance of a high-rise building that catered exclusively to the city's ultra-wealthy. The doorman, a broad-shouldered man named Thomas, straightened up immediately as I approached. He didn't see a fired waitress. He saw the resident of the penthouse suite. "Good evening, Ms. Vantrell," Thomas said, pulling the heavy glass door open with a respectful nod. "Cold one out there tonight?" "Freezing, Thomas." "Thank you," I replied, offering him a warm, genuine smile, the exact kind of smile I had refused to give Corrine. I stepped into the private elevator, scanned my fingerprint on the biometric pad, and hit the button for the top floor. As the car shot upward, silently leaving the city noise behind, I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated my face in the dim cabin. The time for playing small was officially over. The elevator doors parted with a soft chime, opening directly into my apartment. It was a sprawling, multi-level sanctuary of dark hardwood, exposed brick, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an unobstructed, panoramic view of the glittering skyline. It was the kind of real estate that required a net worth with 2 commas. I dropped my bag onto a velvet sofa, walked into the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of sparkling water. No ice. Then, I headed straight for the nerve center of my home, the massive, custom-built mahogany desk overlooking the city, flanked by 4 ultra-high-definition monitors. I tapped the keyboard, and the screens woke from their sleep state. Instantly, the dark room was bathed in the cool, blue glow of shifting data. Live stock tickers scrolled across the top monitor. Complex business dashboards, real-time market analyses, and secure banking portals filled the others. This was my true element. I wasn't a servant, I was a predator in the financial ecosystem, and I had just found my next meal. I picked up my phone and dialed the first number. It rang exactly twice. "Marcus," I said the moment the line connected. I didn't bother with pleasantries. When you pay a corporate attorney a 7-figure retainer, you buy the right to skip the small talk. "Zerai," Marcus replied, his voice sharp and instantly alert, despite the late hour. "What's the play?" I need corporate records for Ravel's restaurant group. Everything. I want the LLC filings, the shell companies, the health inspection records, and every piece of pending litigation from the last 5 years. Dig into his parent company. I want to know exactly where his money lives. Consider it done. Give me 20 minutes to pull the preliminary filings, Marcus said. Hostile. Extremely, I replied, and hung up. I immediately dialed the second number. Elena, I said as my lead accountant answered, the sound of a television playing softly in her background. I need an immediate assessment of my liquid assets. Specifically, my slush funds and unattached capital. How liquid am I right now? I need 3 to 4 million accessible, in cash, within 48 hours. There was a brief pause, followed by the rapid clattering of a keyboard on Elena's end. You have 2.8 million sitting in the Cayman holding account that we just rotated out of tech stocks last week. I can liquidate a fraction of the index funds to cover the rest. You'll have 4.5 million fully cleared and sitting in a domestic escrow account by tomorrow afternoon. What are we buying? Leverage, I said simply. Wire it. And draft the tax implications for a rapid commercial acquisition. Done, she confirmed. I ended the call and dialed the third and final number. David, one of the most ruthless commercial real estate brokers on the Eastern Seaboard, picked up on the first ring. David. The building at 422 Madison, I said, my eyes tracking the live feed of the city streets below. Is it still for sale? It's been sitting on the market quietly for 6 months, David replied, his tone shifting into professional overdrive. The owner hasn't listed it publicly because she doesn't want to spook the commercial tenants. But yes, it's absolutely in play. Why? You want to expand your portfolio? I want the deed, I told him. Find out what her absolute bottom line is, add 20% to it in cash, and tell her I want a signed contract before breakfast. No contingencies, no financing wait times. I'm buying it as is. I'll wake her broker up right now, David promised. I set the phone down on the desk. For the next hour, the screens in front of me became a flurry of incoming PDFs, encrypted financial statements, and property records. I took a sip of my water, leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, and began to dissect the life of Magnus Ravel. It didn't take long for the pristine, arrogant facade of his empire to entirely crumble across my monitors. The first document Marcus sent over was the property record. Magnus didn't own the building. He was a tenant. He had been posturing as the king of the castle, but he was nothing more than a renter holding a commercial lease that was dangerously close to its renewal period. The actual owner was an elderly widow named Eleanor Vance, whose late husband had purchased the block in the 80s. According to David's rapid intelligence gathering, Eleanor was exhausted by the maintenance and property taxes, and was desperate to offload the asset to fund her retirement in Florida. I pulled up the financial records Elena had managed to scrape from public credit filings and corporate debt registries. I actually let out a short, hollow laugh. Magnus Ravel was broke. He was drowning in mezzanine debt, leveraged to the absolute hilt to maintain the illusion of his wealth. The expensive suits, the arrogant swagger, the fawning over VIPs like Victoria Sterling, it wasn't born of success, it was born of absolute, terrified desperation. He needed her $5,000 dinners just to make the interest payments on his loans. I tracked the paper trail of his debt. His loans weren't held by a massive, untouchable financial institution. They had been bundled and sold to a mid-tier, regional bank that was currently restructuring its commercial portfolio. They were actively looking to offload high-risk, underperforming assets. Magnus Ravel's debt was sitting on their books like a radioactive weight. The puzzle pieces hovered in my mind, distinct and sharp, before snapping together with terrifying perfection. I pulled out my leather notebook, the exact same notebook Corrine had sneered at in the basement, and uncapped my pen. I didn't need a calculator. I ran the numbers in my head, mapping the hostile takeover with surgical precision. Step 1. Buy the building from Eleanor Vance in cash, instantly becoming Magnus's landlord and inheriting the power to terminate his lease. Step 2. Approach the regional bank through a proxy firm and purchase Magnus's bundled debt for pennies on the dollar, making me his sole creditor. Step 3. Call the loans due immediately, simultaneously handing him an eviction notice, forcing him into a corner where his only option was to surrender the restaurant's business assets to me for a fraction of their worth to avoid total bankruptcy. I looked at the complex web of arrows and numbers I had drawn across the page. It was flawless. It was a financial guillotine, and Magnus had built the scaffold himself. I leaned back, staring at the glowing monitors, and a genuine, predatory smile finally broke across my face. He had fired me to protect his fragile ego. He had let Corrine humiliate me to appease a horrible woman. But in doing so, he had exposed his entire flank. He thought he was playing a game of power in a dining room, oblivious to the fact that I was playing Monopoly with his entire life. "You handed me the blueprint, Magnus," I whispered to the empty room. The calm anticipation thrummed in my chest, warm and intoxicating. I closed the notebook, picked up my phone to draft the final authorizations for my attorney, and prepared to go hunting. The morning after you decide to dismantle a man's entire reality, the sun still rises with perfect, indifferent routine. But the city felt different to me now. It didn't feel like a labyrinth I had to navigate. It felt like a chessboard I entirely controlled. At 9 o'clock sharp, I pushed open the door of a quiet, unassuming artisan cafe on the Upper West Side. The scent of roasted espresso beans and warm pastries filled the air, a stark contrast to the sterile, high-stakes environments I usually operated in. I spotted her immediately. Eleanor Vance was sitting in a corner booth, nursing a cup of Earl Grey tea. She was a woman in her late 70s, dressed in an elegant but clearly dated wool coat. She possessed a quiet, fading grace, but the deep lines around her eyes and the weary slope of her shoulders told the story of a woman buckling under the weight of an asset she could no longer manage. I approached the table and introduced myself. She offered a tired, polite smile, clearly expecting a grueling negotiation process full of contingencies, lowball offers, and endless commercial inspections. She had been trying to quietly offload the building at 422 Madison for 6 months, terrified that if word got out, her commercial tenants, specifically Magnus Ravel, would panic and default on their leases. I didn't waste her time. I sat down, opened my leather portfolio, and slid a single sheet of heavy stock paper across the table. "Mrs. Vance, I know you are looking for an exit," I said, my voice gentle but absolutely firm. "I am not here to haggle, and I am not here to delay. I want to purchase the building. My offer is $3.2 million. Cash." Eleanor blinked, her hand freezing halfway to her teacup. She looked down at the paper, then back up at me, her eyes wide with shock. "Ms. Vantrell, that is 20% over my private asking price." "It is," I agreed smoothly. "And in exchange for that premium, I require absolute speed. No bank financing waits. No structural contingencies. I buy it entirely as is, and we close in 48 hours. Her hands began to shake slightly. She reached out and touched the edge of the contract as if it were a mirage that might evaporate if she pressed too hard. 4 years, she had been trapped by property taxes, maintenance costs, and the sheer anxiety of dealing with arrogant tenants like Magnus, who I knew routinely paid his rent late and demanded extravagant repairs. I wasn't just offering her money, I was offering her freedom. 48 hours, she whispered, a sudden sheen of tears welling in her eyes. "Are you serious?" "My attorney has already drafted the paperwork, and the funds are sitting in an escrow account right now," I told her, offering a warm, reassuring smile. "Sign it, Mrs. Vance. Go to Florida. Let me handle the headaches at 422 Madison." She didn't even read the fine print. She reached into her purse, pulled out a gold fountain pen, and signed her name with a trembling, profoundly grateful hand. The moment the ink dried, the countdown began. 48 hours until closing. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the gentle warmth of the cafe was replaced by the freezing, sterile air of a mid-tier regional bank in the financial district. I sat in a glass-walled conference room, flanked by my corporate attorney, Marcus, facing 2 mid-level banking executives who were sweating completely through their tailored shirts. They had underestimated me when I walked in. They saw a young woman and assumed I was a proxy for a larger, older buyer. But the moment I laid out my portfolio and the exact nature of the transaction, the condescension vanished, replaced by the nervous, rapid blinking of men who realized they were swimming with a shark. "The Ravel Restaurant Group portfolio," I said, leaning back in the ergonomic leather chair, tapping my pen rhythmically against the glass table. "You hold $1.5 million in mezzanine debt for his operations. It's highly leveraged, entirely risky, and frankly, sitting on your books like a toxic liability. I want to buy it. The senior executive cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. Ms. Vantrell, while we are always open to restructuring, the Ravel account is currently a performing asset. We couldn't possibly let it go for. He was 30 days late on his principal payment in October, and he missed his margin requirements in December. I interrupted smoothly, reciting the numbers I had memorized at 3 in the morning. He is relying on a revolving door of high-net-worth VIPs to cover his operating costs, and his cash flow is a disaster waiting to happen. You know it, and I know it. When the next recession hits, or when he loses a key client, he defaults, and you are left foreclosing on used kitchen equipment that will cover maybe 10 cents on the dollar. I leaned forward, clasping my hands together, pinning the executive with a cold, unblinking stare. I am offering you a clean, quiet exit. $1,050,000. That's 70 cents on the dollar, wired to you by close of business today. You wipe your hands of Magnus Ravel, you clear the liability from your quarterly report before your shareholders notice it, and I become his sole creditor. The two bankers looked at each other. The silence in the glass room stretched tight. They were doing the math, realizing that taking the hit now was infinitely better than explaining a massive default to their board later. 70 cents, the junior executive muttered, looking at the contract Marcus had laid out. He swallowed hard. We transfer the notes entirely. You hold the debt. And the power to call it due, Marcus added seamlessly, his voice a low, threatening rumble. They signed it. They practically tripped over themselves to sign it and offload the sinking ship. I walked out of the bank with the documents tucked safely in my leather portfolio. I didn't just own the ground Magnus Ravel walked on, I now own the financial air he breathed. 24 hours until possession. While I was meticulously forging the chains of their destruction, Magnus and Corrine were blissfully, arrogantly dancing in their cage. According to a quick, frantic text from Maya, the junior server I had protected the day before, the atmosphere at the restaurant was a mix of toxic celebration and operational chaos. Corrine was practically floating across the dining room floor, her ego inflated to massive proportions. She had spent the entire pre-shift meeting gloating about the importance of cutting the dead weight, and reminding the terrified staff that no one, no matter how flawless their service, was irreplaceable. They had already hired my replacement, a nervous 22-year-old girl who had spent her first shift dropping a tray of champagne flutes and crying in the walk-in freezer. Magnus, meanwhile, was entirely insulated from the chaos. He sat in his usual corner booth, sipping a complimentary aged scotch, feeling like an absolute king. He had appeased Victoria Sterling, he had asserted his dominance over his staff, and he believed his empire was entirely secure. He looked around the golden-lit dining room, admiring the crystal and the wealthy patrons, completely oblivious to the invisible crosshairs resting squarely on his forehead. Life went on as normal. They laughed, they poured wine, they counted their evening's profits, entirely blind to the financial guillotine suspended directly above them. The next morning, the trap snapped shut. I sat in Marcus's high-rise office, watching as he meticulously stamped and filed the final pieces of paper. The wire transfers had cleared. The deed from Eleanor Vance was officially registered in the name of ZV Holdings LLC. The bank had formally transferred the debt portfolio. Marcus slid 3 crisp, terrifyingly powerful documents across his mahogany desk. The first was the newly registered deed of ownership for 422 Madison. The second was a formal, legally binding lease termination notice. As the new owner, I was exercising a buried clause in Magnus's commercial lease that allowed for immediate termination upon a change of ownership if the tenant had a history of late payments, which Magnus absolutely did. The third document was the masterpiece. It was a business acquisition offer. It stated that in exchange for not calling his $1.5 million in debt immediately due, which would force him into personal bankruptcy and asset seizure, ZV Holdings LLC would purchase the total operating business of the Ravel Restaurant Group for exactly $1. It's a kill shot, Marcus murmured, looking at the paperwork with a mix of professional awe and deep respect. He has no legal recourse. He has no liquid capital to fight it in court. You've boxed him in on all 4 sides. He boxed himself in, I replied softly, tracing the edge of the eviction notice with my fingertip. I'm just locking the door. I checked the gold watch on my wrist. The anticipation thrumming in my veins was no longer a quiet hum, it was a roaring, electric current. Everything was perfectly aligned. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had entirely inverted. 12 hours until takeover. The third day began with the kind of blinding, crisp winter sunlight that made the city look like it was carved from diamonds. Inside the executive office of the Ravel restaurant group, suspended above the main dining room, Magnus Ravel was experiencing a similar sense of untouchable brilliance. He sat behind his massive, polished mahogany desk, nursing a cup of single-origin espresso. The morning prep was vibrating through the floorboards beneath him, the rhythmic chopping of knives, the clinking of freshly polished crystal, the soft murmur of staff receiving their daily briefings from Corrine. The machine was humming perfectly. Firing Zerai had been a minor, momentary unpleasantness, but in Magnus's mind, it had successfully reaffirmed his absolute authority. Victoria Sterling had renewed her corporate account yesterday afternoon. He was a king safely inside his castle. At exactly 10:15, the heavy, multi-line phone on his desk chimed. Magnus didn't look at the caller ID. He pressed the speaker button, expecting his produce vendor or perhaps a VIP looking for a last-minute table. Magnus Ravel. Mr. Ravel, good morning. This is Arthur Pendleton, legal counsel for Eleanor Vance. A crisp, humorless voice echoed through the office. Magnus frowned, setting his espresso cup down on a leather coaster. Eleanor Vance was his landlord, a timid elderly woman who usually communicated entirely through passive-aggressive emails about the trash bins in the alleyway. She never had her attorney call directly. Arthur, what can I do for you? Magnus asked, injecting a note of impatient condescension into his voice. If this is about the HVAC maintenance. This is not a maintenance call, Mr. Ravel. The attorney interrupted smoothly, entirely immune to Magnus's posturing. I am calling to formally notify you that as of 9 o'clock this morning, the building at 422 Madison has been sold in a private, all-cash transaction. Mrs. Vance is no longer the property owner. Magnus sat forward, his leather chair groaning under the sudden shift in weight. A cold prickle of annoyance crawled up the back of his neck. A new landlord meant new negotiations, potential rent hikes, and a disruption of his carefully managed cash flow. Sold? Without giving me the right of first refusal? That's highly irregular, Arthur. To who? The new ownership group will contact you directly regarding the transition, Pendleton replied mechanically. However, my final duty to Mrs. Vance is to inform you that the new owner has chosen to execute Clause 14B of your commercial lease. The annoyance vanished, instantly replaced by a sharp, icy spike of genuine alarm. Magnus knew exactly what Clause 14B was. It was a draconian holdover from the original lease agreement that allowed for immediate termination of the tenancy upon the sale of the building, provided the tenant had a documented history of late payments. Magnus had been 30 days late on his rent 3 times in the past year. You can't be serious, Magnus snapped, his voice rising, the polished veneer cracking. They can't terminate my lease. I have a fully operational, Michelin-starred restaurant running out of this space. They can, and they have, the attorney said. Your lease is terminated effective immediately. You will be receiving formal written notice by courier today. Good luck, Mr. Ravel. The line clicked dead. Magnus stared at the blinking red light on his console, his chest suddenly tight. A new landlord aggressively clearing the building? It made no sense. Unless they were a massive developer looking to gut the block, no sane investor bought a commercial property and immediately evicted a paying, high-profile restaurant. He stood up, running a hand through his perfectly slicked hair. He needed to call his own lawyer. He needed to file an injunction. He reached for the receiver again, but before his fingers could brush the plastic, his private, unlisted cell phone began to vibrate violently against the mahogany wood. He snatched it up. The caller ID read First Regional Commercial, Account Management. Listen to me. Magnus barked into the phone the second he answered, perfectly ready to take his surging panic out on his banking representative. I need an emergency line of credit opened right now. My landlord just sold the building out from under me, and I have to. Mr. Ravel, please stop speaking. The voice on the other end cut in. It wasn't his usual, friendly account manager. It was a senior risk assessment officer, and he sounded incredibly tense. I am not calling to authorize a credit line. I am calling to inform you of a structural change to your debt portfolio. Magnus froze. The air in his office suddenly felt terrifyingly thin. A structural change? What does that mean? At 9:30 this morning, the bank completed a secondary market transaction, the officer explained, his tone flat and heavily rehearsed. Your entire mezzanine debt portfolio, including the $1.5 million operating loan for the Ravel restaurant group, has been sold to a private investor. The bank no longer holds your notes. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The blood roared in Magnus's ears. You sold my debt? You can't just bundle my operating loans and sell them without my consent. It is standard practice for high-risk, leveraged accounts, Mr. Ravel, the banker replied coldly. Especially accounts that have recently missed margin requirements. I am legally obligated to inform you that the purchasing investor has reviewed your covenant breaches and has chosen to exercise their right to accelerate. They are calling the loans due. Due. Magnus choked out, his hand gripping the edge of his desk so hard his knuckles turned white. Due when? Immediately. In full. That is impossible. I don't have $1.5 million in liquid cash. Magnus shouted, his voice echoing off the glass walls of his office. The panic had entirely consumed him now. Without that loan, he couldn't make payroll tomorrow. He couldn't pay his vendors. He would be forced into immediate, catastrophic bankruptcy. Who bought them? Give me a name. I need to negotiate with them. We are not at liberty to say, Mr. Ravel. They informed us they would be contacting you directly. Have a good day. Another click. Another deadline. Magnus dropped the cell phone. It clattered against the wood, the sound deafening in the suddenly quiet office. His breathing was shallow and ragged. In the span of exactly 4 minutes, his entire reality had been dismantled. His building was gone. His money was gone. He was standing on the edge of a sheer cliff, and someone he couldn't even see had just shoved him into the abyss. He burst out of his office, descending the spiral staircase to the main dining room like a man running from a fire. He was sweating through his bespoke suit. Corrine was standing near the hostess stand, holding a clipboard and berating a young busboy about the alignment of the silver on table 4. She looked up as Magnus approached, her sharp scowl instantly transforming into an expression of deep concern when she saw the raw terror on her boss's face. Magnus? She asked, stepping forward. What's wrong? You look pale. Before he could answer, the heavy front doors of the restaurant swung open. The winter wind rushed in, followed by a man in a crisp, dark suit holding a thick, black leather courier portfolio. He bypassed the hostess stand entirely, his eyes scanning the room until they locked onto Magnus. He moved with absolute, terrifying purpose. Magnus Ravel? The courier asked, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the morning prep. Yes, Magnus breathed, his voice barely a whisper. The courier unzipped the portfolio and withdrew a single, heavy envelope. It was made of thick, high-quality matte paper, sealed with a minimalist, embossed crest. He handed it to Magnus, tapped a button on his digital tablet to record the delivery time, and walked out without another word. Corrine crowded in next to him, her eyes wide with frantic curiosity. Magnus, what is it? A lawsuit? Did Victoria Sterling's people complain? Magnus didn't answer. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely tear the flap of the envelope open. He pulled out 2 sheets of heavy, watermarked legal paper. At the top of the page, printed in stark, modern typography, was a letterhead, ZV Holdings LLC. Magnus's eyes darted violently across the text, absorbing the legal jargon like physical blows. Formal notification of property acquisition. 422 Madison. Immediate termination of commercial lease. Formal notification of debt assumption. Acceleration of all outstanding liabilities totaling $1,540,000 US. It was real. The same company had bought the building and the banknotes. It was a perfectly orchestrated, flawlessly executed hostile takeover. Whoever ran ZV Holdings had specifically targeted him, hunted him down, and trapped him in a cage with no exits. He forced his eyes to track down to the final paragraph. In lieu of immediate eviction and forced asset liquidation via bankruptcy proceedings, ZV Holdings LLC extends a one-time, non-negotiable offer. ZV Holdings LLC will purchase the entirety of the Ravel Restaurant Group's operating assets, brand rights, and liquor licenses for the sum of $1 US. You have exactly 24 hours to sign the enclosed transfer agreement. $1. Magnus whispered, the words scraping out of his throat. He was hallucinating. It was the only explanation. Someone was taking his multi-million-dollar empire for a single, insulting piece of loose change. He looked down at the signature line. He stared at it. His brain simply refused to process the letters. The cognitive dissonance was so absolute, so violently jarring, that for a moment, he forgot how to breathe. There, signed in dark, elegant blue ink, was the name. Zerai Vantrell, Principal. No, Magnus gasped, stumbling backward until his spine hit the edge of the hostess stand. The heavy legal documents slipped from his fingers, fluttering to the hardwood floor. No, that's impossible. Corrine snatched the papers off the floor. Her eyes scanned the text, her lips moving silently as she read. When she reached the signature line, all the blood drained from her face, leaving her a sickly, translucent white. The clipboard she had been holding clattered to the floor. Zerai. Corrine choked out, her voice pitching into a hysterical, breathless squeak. She looked around the empty dining room as if expecting the girl she had humiliated yesterday to suddenly jump out from behind a velvet curtain. Zerai Vantrell? The waitress? Our waitress. She bought the debt, Magnus muttered, dragging his hands down his face, his mind fracturing. She bought the building. She bought the whole goddamn bank. She can't do this. Corrine shrieked, the panic finally breaking through her shock. She grabbed Magnus's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. It's illegal. You can't just fire an employee and have them buy your life the next day. Call your lawyer. Call him right now. Magnus ripped his arm away from her, his hands still trembling as he pulled his cell phone from his pocket. He hit the speed dial for H's corporate attorney. He put it on speakerphone, holding the device between them like a lifeline. Steve, Magnus pleaded the second the line connected. Steve, tell me you got a copy of the filing from ZV Holdings. I'm looking at it right now, Magnus. His lawyer's voice echoed out of the small speaker. There was no comfort in his tone. Only the grim, detached finality of a mortician identifying a body. Tell me we can fight it. Tell me it's illegal. She's a server. She poured water in my dining room yesterday. It doesn't matter if she was sweeping the alleyway, Magnus, Steve replied heavily. The capital is completely verified. The transfers are ironclad. She bypassed the standard waiting periods by paying cash premiums directly to the sellers. It's the most aggressive, flawlessly executed corporate strangulation I've seen in 20 years. It's completely legal. Corrine let out a sound that was half sob, half scream, covering her mouth with both hands. What do I do, Steve? Magnus begged, the last shred of his arrogant pride entirely dissolving into the terror of a cornered animal. What are my options? You have no options, the attorney said quietly. If you don't sign the buyout for $1, she evicts you tomorrow and calls the loans due. The state seizes your personal assets to cover the debt. You lose your home, your cars, and your accounts, and you'll still be forced into bankruptcy. Sign the paper, Magnus. Walk away with nothing before she makes you walk away with less. The line clicked dead for the third and final time that morning. Magnus slowly lowered the phone. He looked around the breathtaking, golden-lit luxury of his dining room. The crystal chandeliers overhead seemed to mock him, glittering with a wealth that no longer belonged to him. The empire was completely intact, but he was suddenly a ghost haunting its halls. Corrine stood beside him, her entire body shaking, clutching the thick white envelope to her chest. She looked at the folded apron resting neatly on table 1, exactly where Zerai had left it less than 24 hours ago. You should keep my personnel file, Zerai had whispered. You're going to need it. The walls of the golden cage hadn't just closed in, they had entirely crushed them. And the countdown to 0 had already begun. At exactly 11:45, the heavy mahogany front doors of the restaurant swung open, letting in a rush of crisp, freezing winter air that cut straight through the suffocating tension of the dining room. The lunch service was just beginning its precarious ascent. A few early corporate tables were already seated, and the staff was moving with a frantic, nervous energy, fully aware that Magnus and Corrine had been locked in the upstairs office all morning in a state of absolute, terrified panic. The golden chandeliers were dialed to their daytime warmth, casting long, elegant shadows across the polished hardwood floor. I stepped over the threshold, and for the first time in 3 years, I didn't walk toward the coat check or the employee corridor. I walked directly into the center of the main dining room. I had shed the subservient skin of the black apron. In its place, I wore a sharply tailored, midnight blue CEO blazer over a sleek, high-necked black blouse, a deliberate, elevated echo of the uniform I had been forced to strip off yesterday. My posture was no longer bowed by the invisible weight of anticipating orders. It was absolute and dominant. In my left hand, I carried a slim, black leather portfolio. Trailing exactly one step behind me, radiating the quiet, lethal presence of a corporate executioner, was my attorney, Marcus. Chloe, the lead hostess, was the first to see me. She froze mid-sentence while holding a stack of leather-bound menus, her eyes widening so far I thought they might practically fall out of her head. The sharp, authoritative click of my heels against the floorboards drew the attention of the floor staff. One by one, servers stopped in their tracks. Busboys lowered their trays. The ambient hum of the room began to drain away, replaced by the electric, undeniable gravity of a tectonic shift. From across the room, near the swinging kitchen doors, Corrine appeared. Her face was still a sickly, translucent shade of gray from the morning's revelations, her eyes sunken and frantic. But the moment she saw me standing in the center of her pristine floor, decades of toxic middle management instinct violently overrode her panic. She couldn't comprehend the reality of the legal documents she had just read. To Corrine, the universe was a rigid hierarchy, and I was perpetually at the bottom of it. She marched across the dining room, her heels clicking in a frantic, uneven rhythm, her face twisting into a mask of desperate, petty outrage. "What are you doing here?" Corrine hissed, keeping her voice low to avoid disturbing the seated patrons, though her tone was venomous enough to strip paint. She stopped a few feet away, practically vibrating with indignation. "You can't be here, Zerai. You were fired yesterday. If you are here to beg for your job, or cause a scene, I will have security throw you out into the street." I didn't blink. I didn't shrink back. I simply looked at her, tilting my head a fraction of an inch, absorbing the full, pathetic weight of her delusion. I rested one hand casually on my waist, the leather portfolio held loosely in the other. A soft, glowing halo of amber light from the chandelier above caught the edge of my hair, subtly framing the exact moment I dismantled her entire world. "I'm not here to beg, Corrine," I said, my voice smooth, resonant, and pitched perfectly to carry across the suddenly silent floor. "And I'm not here to cause a scene. I'm here for the staff meeting." Corrine let out a harsh, incredulous scoff. "There is no staff meeting. And even if there was, you are not a member of this staff." "No," I agreed, a slight, knowing smirk curving the corner of my mouth. "I am not. I'm here as the new owner." The words hung in the air, absolute and undeniable. Corrine's jaw literally slackened. The remaining blood drained from her face, leaving her looking hollow and entirely fragile. She clutched the clipboard against her chest as if it were a shield, her eyes darting wildly to Marcus, then to the leather portfolio in my hand, and finally back to my face. Her brain was violently trying to reject the information, but the sheer, unwavering authority in my posture offered her no escape. "Marcus," I said, not breaking eye contact with Corrine. "Please inform Mr. Ravel that we are waiting for him on the floor." "Right away, Ms. Vantrell," Marcus replied smoothly. But he didn't need to go far. The door to the executive stairwell slowly opened, and Magnus Ravel descended into the dining room. He looked like a dead man walking. The bespoke suit that had looked so effortlessly powerful yesterday now hung on him like a shroud. He was sweating, his tie loosened, his normally slicked-back hair slightly unkempt. The absolute loss of control had aged him 10 years in a matter of hours. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he stopped, his eyes locking onto me. He stared in disbelief, his face tense, one hand raising slightly in a gesture of confused, helpless surrender. Beside him, Corrine had completely frozen in shock, her eyes wide, her mouth slightly open as the catastrophic reality finally pieced her denial. The two former authority figures who had publicly humiliated me less than 24 hours ago were now standing before me, their power entirely collapsed. "Zerai," Magnus breathed, his voice a hoarse, scraping rasp. "Please. Let's go up to the office. We can negotiate this privately. We don't need to do this down here." "We absolutely need to do this down here, Magnus," I replied, my tone leaving no room for negotiation. You were the one who established the precedent that personnel matters should be handled publicly, in the middle of the dining room. I am simply honoring your management style." I turned my attention to the bewildered staff. Maya, Chef Laurent, Chloe, and a dozen others were standing at the edges of the room, watching the impossible unfold. "Everyone, please gather around," I announced, my voice warm and commanding. They hesitated for a second, glancing nervously at Magnus, but when he didn't countermand the order, they slowly drifted toward the center of the room, forming a wide circle around the three of us. Marcus stepped forward, placing his leather briefcase onto the nearest empty dining table. The snap of the brass latches sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. He withdrew the final transfer agreement and a heavy, gold Mont Blanc pen, laying them precisely on the white tablecloth. "Mr. Ravel," Marcus said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "As stipulated in the ultimatum delivered this morning, ZV Holdings LLC is prepared to assume complete ownership of the Ravel Restaurant Group's operating assets, entirely clearing your immediate liability of the accelerated debt. In exchange, you will sign over all brand rights, physical assets, and existing operational licenses. The purchase price is exactly $1. Marcus reached into his tailored pocket, pulled out a crisp, single $1 bill, and placed it on top of the legal document. A collective, stunned gasp rippled through the gathered staff. Maya covered her mouth with both hands. Chef Laurent's eyes widened in absolute shock. They were witnessing a corporate slaughter. Magnus stared at the dollar bill as if it were coated in acid. His hands were trembling visibly. He looked up at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears of pure, unadulterated humiliation. He had built this empire. He had worshipped it. And now, he was being forced to sell it for pocket change to the woman he had treated like dirt. "You ruined me," he whispered, the words meant only for me. "No, Magnus," I replied softly, stepping closer so only he and Corrine could hear the final verdict. "You ruined yourself. You built a house of cards fueled by arrogance and debt, and you foolishly believed that because I wore an apron, I couldn't see the wind blowing. You made a choice yesterday to value a toxic ego over human dignity. This is simply the cost of that choice." I pointed to the gold pen. "Sign the paper. Or Marcus makes the phone call, the sheriffs lock the doors in 20 minutes, and you leave here with millions in personal debt." Magnus squeezed his eyes shut. A single, pathetic tear tracked down his cheek. He reached out with a shaking hand, picked up the heavy gold pen, and leaned over the table. With a few jagged, frantic strokes, he signed his empire away. Marcus instantly collected the document, checked the signature, and nodded at me. "It's done. You have total possession." Magnus slowly stood up. He didn't look at the staff. He didn't look at Corrine, who was currently weeping silently beside him, clutching her useless clipboard. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy ring of brass keys. Attached to the ring was a thick, plastic tag that management used for the master set. It had a sticker on it that read "Sold," a petty joke Corrine had made months ago when they bought a new wine vault. He held the keys out. I raised my hands slightly forward and took them. The cold, heavy brass settled into my palm, a profound, undeniable physical manifestation of my victory. "Now," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the dining room. I looked directly at Corrine, and then to Magnus. "You are both trespassing on my property. You have exactly 5 minutes to clear out your desks and exit through the alleyway doors. If either of you ever steps foot in my restaurant again, I will have you arrested." Corrine let out a choked sob, dropping her clipboard. It clattered loudly against the hardwood. She turned and practically ran toward the back office, her designer heels slipping frantically on the floor. Magnus lingered for a fraction of a second, staring at the golden chandeliers one last time, before lowering his head and shuffling toward the back, an entirely broken man. The moment the heavy kitchen doors swung shut behind them, the absolute silence of the dining room shattered. Maya let out a sudden, breathless laugh that quickly turned into a cheer. Chef Laurent crossed his massive arms over his chest, a slow, deeply satisfied grin spreading across his face. A wave of applause, hesitant at first, then roaring and triumphant, broke out among the staff. I turned to face the people who had been my peers, my fellow soldiers in the trenches of this toxic establishment. I held up a hand, and the applause gently subsided. This restaurant has always survived because of the people in this room. I told them, my voice filled with a genuine, profound respect that Magnus had never been capable of. Starting today, things change. The toxic hierarchy is dead. We do not bow to abusive clients. We do not sacrifice our dignity for a tip. We will rebuild this establishment into what it was always meant to be. I looked down at the keys in my hand, my thumb brushing over the sold tag, and then looked back up at the golden, warmly lit expanse of my new empire. Now, I smiled, sliding the keys into the pocket of my tailored blazer. Lunch service is officially open. Let's get to work. The transition of power did not happen with a chaotic explosion. It happened with the smooth, undeniable force of a rising tide. Over the next 3 weeks, the toxic, suffocating atmosphere that had choked the restaurant for years completely evaporated. The golden chandeliers still hummed with the frequency of wealth, the crystals still gleamed, and the floor-to-ceiling windows still framed the glittering, freezing city. But the soul of the building had fundamentally changed. It no longer felt like a velvet-lined prison. It felt like an empire that actually belonged to the people who kept it alive. I stood by the hostess stand on a bustling Friday night, wearing a sharply tailored, emerald green CEO blazer. I didn't hide in the executive office upstairs the way Magnus had. I stayed on the floor, observing the rhythm of the room, feeling the pulse of the service. Maya glided past me, carrying a silver tray with absolute confidence. Her hands no longer shook. When a demanding guest at table 4 asked for a complicated wine substitution, she didn't look terrified. She handled it with the effortless grace of a professional who knew her management had her back. Chef Laurent's kitchen was operating at peak efficiency, turning out culinary masterpieces not out of fear of retribution, but out of genuine, unbridled passion for the craft. We had lost a few of the more abusive VIPs, the ones who preferred a side of degradation with their dry-aged steaks, but our reservations had actually tripled. Word had spread through the city's elite that the restaurant was under new, fiercely protective management. Excellence was still the standard, but cruelty was no longer on the menu. I was just finishing a brief conversation with Chloe when the heavy mahogany front doors swung open. The winter wind howled into the lobby, and in walked Victoria Sterling. She was flanked by the exact same entourage of sharply dressed, aggressively bored women. She wore a different fur coat tonight, mink instead of chinchilla, but carried the exact same aura of weaponized entitlement. She hadn't been in since the night she demanded I kneel on the floor. Clearly, she assumed her dramatic performance had successfully ruined my life, and she was returning to the scene of her victory to bask in the subservience of the remaining staff. Chloe stiffened beside me, her eyes darting nervously in my direction. "I've got this, Chloe," I murmured, stepping smoothly out from behind the podium. I positioned myself squarely in the center of the entryway, blocking Victoria's path to the dining room. I didn't cross my arms. I didn't scowl. I simply stood there, radiating the absolute, quiet dominance of a woman standing in her own house. Victoria stopped short, her eyes sweeping over me. It took her brain a second to process what she was seeing. She recognized my face, but the context was entirely wrong. I wasn't wearing a black apron. I wasn't looking down at the floor. I was wearing an outfit that cost more than her alimony payment, and I was looking at her with a chilling, impenetrable calm. "You," Victoria breathed, her heavily contoured face twisting into a mask of sudden, violent outrage. She looked around the lobby as if searching for a manager to scream at. "What on earth are you doing here? Corrine fired you. If you think you can sneak back into this establishment after the way you disrespected me." "Corrine doesn't work here anymore, Victoria," I interrupted. My voice was pitched low, but it cut through her shrill complaints like a diamond slicing glass. Victoria blinked, momentarily derailed. "What do you mean she doesn't work here? Where is Magnus? Get Magnus out here immediately. I want you thrown out onto the street." "Magnus doesn't work here anymore either," I said, taking a single, deliberate step forward. "He went bankrupt. He lost the restaurant, he lost his lease, and he lost his power. He sold it all to avoid complete financial ruin." Victoria's entourage exchanged confused, nervous glances. Victoria herself puffed up, her ego refusing to accept the shifting reality. "I don't care about Magnus's financial problems. I am a VIP client, and I am telling you to get out of my way so I can go to table 1. "Table 1 is occupied," I replied smoothly. "And even if it weren't, you wouldn't be sitting there." Your corporate account has been permanently closed, and your name has been placed on the restricted list." The color rapidly drained from her face. In Victoria's world, being publicly banned from a high-status establishment was a fate worse than death. It was social exile. "You can't do that," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the marble walls of the lobby. Several diners turned their heads, watching the drama unfold, but this time, I wasn't the one on trial. "You are a waitress. You are the help." I reached into the pocket of my blazer and slowly withdrew the heavy brass ring of master keys, the plastic soled tag catching the light of the chandelier. I let them jingle once, a sharp, metallic sound of absolute finality. "I was the help," I corrected her, my voice dropping to a whisper that forced her to lean in to hear her own eviction. "Now, I am the owner. I own the building, I own the restaurant, and I own the ground you are currently standing on. Which means, as of this exact second, you are legally trespassing." Victoria stood completely frozen. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The woman she had tried to humiliate, the woman she had demanded kneel before her, was now the undisputed king of the chessboard. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had entirely crushed her. Her friends took a collective step backward, suddenly eager to distance themselves from the radioactive embarrassment of the moment. "If you do not turn around and walk out that door," I continued, my expression completely blank, "I will have my security team escort you out. And I promise you, Victoria, the sidewalk is incredibly cold tonight." For a moment, I thought she might actually scream. Her mouth opened, her chest heaved, but there were no words left to weaponize. Her money meant nothing here. Her status meant nothing here. She had absolutely no leverage. With a tight, humiliated gasp, Victoria Sterling turned on her heel, her heavy fur coat swishing aggressively around her legs. She pushed through the heavy mahogany doors and practically fled into the freezing Chicago winter, her entourage scurrying quickly behind her. The heavy doors swung shut, sealing the cold air outside. I stood in the lobby for a moment, listening to the warm, beautiful hum of my restaurant. The clinking of crystal, the soft jazz, the genuine laughter of my staff and patrons. The poison was entirely gone. I turned and walked through the dining room, offering a warm smile to a table of celebrating guests, before making my way up the spiral staircase to the executive office. I sat behind the massive mahogany desk, overlooking the glowing, golden empire I had reclaimed. I opened my leather notebook, running my pen over the perfectly balanced ledgers, and for the first time in years, I took a deep, full breath. I was no longer the invisible girl in the apron holding her breath in the basement. I had stepped into the light, and I was never, ever stepping back into the shadows. Scene fades to black, upbeat, suspenseful outro music plays. Wow, what a journey. Welcome back to the end of the line, Twistofferal TV family. Take a deep breath and let your heart rate settle. From the suffocating basement break room to the ultimate CEO takeover, Zerai proved that true power doesn't have to scream. Sometimes, true power is just waiting patiently with a multi-million-dollar portfolio and a flawless plan. Magnus and Corrine thought they were playing checkers, but our girl was out here playing 4D chess. I want to take a moment to genuinely appreciate you, my amazing audience, for staying with me to the very end of this story. You are the absolute best, and creating these high-stakes, ultimate comeback stories for you is my greatest passion. If you felt that rush of adrenaline when Zerai walked back into that dining room with the sold keys, then you know exactly why we do this. If you loved this story of ultimate karma and revenge success, please smash that like button, share this video with someone who needs a reminder to never underestimate the quiet ones, and subscribe to Twistofferal TV so you never miss another captivating story. And before you go, don't forget our tradition. Drop down into the comment section right now and tell me, what country are you watching from today? I love seeing how far the Twistofferal family stretches around the globe. Until next time, keep your head high, play the long game, and never let anyone make you feel small. I'll see you in the next story.